An officer followed a black girl to the cafe every day, suspecting her. But the truth behind her visits left him in tears. Subscribe to see what happens next and tell us, where are you watching from? Outside the bustling cafe, a small figure sat quietly on the sidewalk, her back against the brick wall. 9-year-old Shyla clutched a worn notebook close to her chest, her thin arms wrapped tightly around it, as if the book itself was the only thing keeping her together. She gazed through the large cafe window with a longing in her wide brown eyes. A soft golden glow from inside poured out onto the street, casting warm, welcoming light that made her feel closer to the memories she cherished. Inside the cafe, people laughed and chatted over steaming cups of coffee and plates of pastries. The clatter of dishes, the hum of conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter created an atmosphere of life and comfort. To any passerby, it was just another cafe on just another street. But to Shyla, this place was sacred. It was the place where her father had promised they would celebrate once he came home from the war. But he never did. Every day after school, Shyla came to this cafe, sitting outside in silence. She didn't need to go inside to feel close to him. It was enough to sit here, watching life go by, imagining what it would have been like if he were still alive. She could almost hear his deep, warm voice saying, "One day, we'll sit here and eat the biggest slice of chocolate cake they have, just you and me." Her father, Sergeant Michael Thompson, was the center of her universe. He wasn't just her dad, he was her hero. He had taught her how to ride a bike, how to tie her shoes, and how to stand up for herself. More than anything, he taught her how to be strong, no matter what. But being strong was getting harder every day. The notebook in her hands was filled with letters to her father, written every day since the day they got the news of his death. In each letter, she told him about her day, about her friends, about the things that scared her, and about the things that made her smile. It was her way of keeping him close, of pretending that he was still there, listening to her, even though she knew deep down he was gone. Today, her letter started with, "Hi, Dad, I miss you. Today was okay, I guess. I got a B on my math quiz. Sorry, I know you told me to study harder." She paused, her pencil hovering over the paper as her heart clenched with the familiar ache. "I came to our cafe again. I know you would have liked it today. It smells like cinnamon. You always liked cinnamon." Tears threatened to spill, but she wiped her eyes fiercely. Her dad wouldn't want her to cry. He had always told her to stay strong no matter what, and so she stayed strong for him. As she wrote, a shadow fell over her. She looked up briefly, catching sight of the tall, broad-shouldered police officer standing across the street. Officer Walter Brooks had noticed her several times before, always sitting in the same spot, always holding that same notebook. To him, it didn't look like the innocent habit of a grieving child. Instead, it looked suspicious. Walter was a man of habit and caution. Years on, the force had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him that the presence of the girl was strange. She didn't look like trouble, but the fact that she was there every day unsettled him. Why would a young girl sit alone outside a cafe every day after school? Something about it didn't feel right. Walter's prejudices began to surface as he watched her. In his mind, people from certain neighborhoods, and especially young black kids, were always up to something. He didn't mean to be cruel, it was just the way he thought. Years of seeing the worst in people had hardened him. To him, this girl was just another kid who might cause trouble if left unchecked. Shyla noticed the way the officer was looking at her, his gaze sharp and full of suspicion. A chill ran down her spine. She had done nothing wrong, but the way he stared at her made her feel like she had. She lowered her head, pretending to focus on her writing, hoping he would just go away. But he didn't. Her heart raced in her chest. She remembered the stories her mom had told her about people who looked like them getting into trouble just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. She clutched her notebook tighter, as if it could protect her, and kept writing, her hand trembling slightly. "Dad," she whispered under her breath as she scribbled in the notebook, "I wish you were here." The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she sat there, trapped between her need to stay connected to her father and the fear growing inside her. The officer hadn't moved from his spot across the street, and Shyla could feel his gaze boring into her, making it impossible to concentrate. The noise from the cafe, the laughter, the clinking of cups, faded into the background, drowned out by the pounding of her heart. All she could think about was how wrong everything felt. This place, which had once been filled with warmth and love, now felt like a cage. Shyla's father had made her promise that she would always come to the cafe no matter what. "It's our place," he had told her. "As long as you go there, I'll be with you." But now, sitting under the weight of the officer's suspicious gaze, she wasn't sure if she could keep that promise anymore. She glanced down at her notebook and added one final line to her letter. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Dad. It's too hard." She closed the notebook with a soft sigh, her small fingers tracing the worn edges of the cover. It was all she had left of him. The notebook, the cafe, and the memories that threatened to slip away like sand through her fingers. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows on the street, Shyla knew she had to leave. The officer was still watching her, and the fear inside her had grown too strong to ignore. She stood up slowly, tucking the notebook under her arm, and gave the cafe one last, lingering glance. "I'll come back tomorrow," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. She had to come back. She had to keep the promise she made to her father, even if it hurt, even if the world around her felt like it was closing in, because that's what her dad would have wanted. And no matter how scared she felt, she would do it for him. As Shyla turned to leave, she felt the officer's gaze follow her, heavy and unrelenting. She knew this wasn't the end of their encounter. Somehow, deep down, she felt that this was only the beginning of something bigger, something she couldn't yet understand. With one last look at the cafe, she whispered, "I love you, Dad," and walked away, the notebook clutched tightly to her chest. And across the street, Officer Brooks narrowed his eyes, making a mental note to keep an eye on her. Whatever this girl was up to, he was going to find out. The next day, the autumn air was crisp and the street was busy with people rushing to and from work. Shyla sat in her usual spot outside the cafe, pulling her jacket closer around her small frame. The notebook rested on her lap, opened to a fresh page. She had written only a few lines, but the weight of the officer's gaze from the day before still clung to her like a shadow. The fear hadn't left her, yet she had returned, because she promised her dad she would. Her pencil wavered over the page. "Hi, Dad. I came back. I know you'd want me to. I'm trying to be strong, just like you said." Her hand froze mid-sentence as her eyes drifted to the far side of the street. There he was again. Officer Brooks, leaning casually against the hood of his patrol car, but his sharp, watchful eyes were anything but relaxed. He was looking right at her, his expression unreadable, though Shyla could feel the suspicion radiating from him. Her stomach twisted painfully. She tucked a strand of her curly hair behind her ear, trying to shrink into herself, hoping he wouldn't come over. But he did. Brooks crossed the street, his heavy boots thudding on the pavement. With each step, Shyla's heartbeat quickened. She hugged the notebook closer to her chest as if it could shield her from what was coming. The officer stopped a few feet away from her, looming over her small frame. "You again," he said, folding his arms across his broad chest. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "What are you doing here every day, kid?" Shyla's mouth went dry. She stared at the pavement, not trusting herself to speak. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Brooks pressed, a little more forcefully now. "You planning something? You waiting for someone?" Shyla shook her head quickly, still avoiding his gaze. She wanted to say something, to explain, but the words stuck in her throat, tangled with fear. What could she say that he would understand? Brooks sighed, rubbing the back of his neck in frustration. "Look, kid, I don't know what you're up to, but people don't sit outside cafes every day for no reason. So tell me, why are you really here?" Shyla clutched her notebook tighter, her knuckles turning white. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The officer's questions felt like punches, knocking the air out of her lungs. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Be strong, baby girl, no matter what." But how could she be strong when she felt so small? Brooks crouched down to her level, his dark eyes narrowing as he studied her. "What's in the notebook? Let me see." "No!" The word burst from her lips before she could stop it. Panic surged through her. That notebook was her connection to her father. Letting him see it would feel like handing over a piece of her soul to a stranger who wouldn't understand. Brooks's brow furrowed, and suspicion deepened in his gaze. "Why not? What are you hiding?" "I'm not hiding anything," Shyla whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, just leave me alone." The officer exhaled sharply, straightening up again. "Look, I don't want trouble, kid, but if I see you here again tomorrow, I'll have to start asking some serious questions." Tears burned in the corners of Shyla's eyes, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of him. Her father wouldn't want her to cry, but the knot in her chest tightened painfully, and she felt like the walls of her world were closing in. Brooks shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Kids these days." Then he turned and walked back across the street, leaving Shyla sitting on the cold pavement, her heart heavy with fear and confusion. She stared after him, her hands trembling as she hugged the notebook even closer. For the first time since her father's death, the cafe no longer felt like a place of comfort. It felt tainted, like the one thing she had left of him was slipping through her fingers. She looked down at the notebook, her vision blurred by unshed tears, and wrote, "Dad, I don't know if I can keep doing this. I tried to be strong, but it's getting harder. I wish you were here." The words felt heavy, like a confession she wasn't ready to make, even to herself. But she couldn't stop writing. It was the only thing that kept her connected to him, the only way to feel like he was still a part of her life. As the sun began to set, Shyla closed the notebook and tucked it under her arm. She stood up slowly, casting one last glance at the cafe window, where the warm light flickered invitingly. For a moment, she imagined her father sitting across from her at one of the tables, smiling and telling her it would all be okay. But the vision faded, and the emptiness returned. She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her jacket and whispered, "I'll come back tomorrow, Dad, I promise." With heavy steps, she walked away, her heart aching in a way that words could never fully express. And across the street, Officer Brooks watched her go, suspicion lingering in his gaze. Whatever that girl was hiding, he was determined to find out. And the next time he saw her, he wouldn't be so easy on her. As Shyla disappeared down the street, the officer stood there for a long time, hands on his hips, staring after her. Something about the way she looked at him, so small, so scared, stuck with him in a way he didn't expect, but he shook it off. He had a job to do. Tomorrow he would get his answers. The next day, a cold breeze swept through the city, rustling the fallen leaves along the sidewalk. Shyla walked with her head down, her notebook clutched tightly against her chest. Her heart was heavy, and each step felt harder than the last. She had almost decided not to come to the cafe that day. The fear from her last encounter with Officer Brooks still echoed inside her, making her want to stay far away from this place. But she had made a promise to her father, and a promise to her father was a promise she could never break. When she reached the cafe, Shyla hesitated, glancing around nervously. Her eyes darted from one side of the street to the other, searching for any sign of the officer. She wanted nothing more than to be left alone today, to sit by the window and write her letter in peace. But it seemed fate had other plans. The sharp, unmistakable sound of boots against pavement echoed in her ears, and her heart sank. She turned to see Officer Brooks approaching her, his expression a mix of frustration and suspicion. Shyla's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively took a step back, her grip on her notebook tightening until her knuckles turned white. "Well, look who decided to come back," Brooks said, his voice carrying an edge of sarcasm. He stopped in front of her, his tall frame casting a shadow over her. "Didn't I tell you yesterday that I didn't want to see you here again?" Shyla opened her mouth to respond, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her. She felt her entire body go tense, fear washing over her in waves. She shook her head slowly, her lips parting in a silent plea. "I'm talking to you, kid," Brooks said, his patience wearing thin. He reached out and grabbed her by the arm, his grip firm. "What are you doing here? What's in that notebook?" "No!" Shyla exclaimed, her voice finally breaking free. She tried to pull away, but the officer's grip only tightened. Her heart pounded in her ears, the fear turning into panic. "Please, just let me go." Brooks wasn't listening. His frustration had boiled over, and all he could see was a kid who was hiding something, refusing to cooperate. He yanked the notebook from her grasp, ignoring her protests as he flipped it open, expecting to find something incriminating. Instead, he found page after page filled with letters. Messy, handwritten letters addressed to Dad. His brow furrowed as he scanned the words, his confusion growing with each line. They were simple letters, talking about school, about her day, about how much she missed her father. "What is this?" he muttered, his grip on her arm loosening slightly as he glanced back at Shyla. Her face was flushed with fear, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. She looked so young, so vulnerable. It's for my dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. She tried to pull her arm free again, her whole body trembling. "Please, just give it back." Brooks stared at her for a moment, the pieces slowly beginning to fall into place. He looked back down at the notebook at the words scrawled across the page. "I miss you, Dad. I hope you're proud of me." His eyes flicked back up to the girl, and for the first time he saw the pain behind her eyes. The fear that wasn't just because of him, but something deeper. Something that had nothing to do with him at all. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. A small crowd had started to gather, people stopping to watch as the officer held the young girl by the arm. Murmurs spread through the onlookers, some taking out their phones to record the scene. Shyla's face burned with shame and fear, her eyes darting around as she realized they were all watching her, judging her. "Please," she begged, her voice barely a whisper now, "just let me go." Brooks's grip finally slackened, and he let go of her arm, shoving the notebook back into her hands. He took a step back, his expression unreadable as he looked down at her. The reality of what he had done began to sink in. He had treated this little girl like a criminal, had terrified her without ever stopping to consider that maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth. "Go home, kid," he said, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "Just go home." Shyla didn't need to be told twice. She clutched her notebook to her chest and turned, running as fast as her legs could carry her. She didn't look back, didn't stop until she was far away from the cafe, from the officer, from the crowd. When she finally stopped, she was several blocks away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She leaned against the wall of a building, her whole body shaking as she tried to catch her breath. Her eyes stung with tears, and she hugged her notebook tighter, her fingers brushing against the cover as if to reassure herself that it was still there. How could everything have gone so wrong? She slid down the wall, sitting on the cold pavement as tears spilled down her cheeks. She opened the notebook, her vision blurry as she looked at the page where Officer Brooks had stopped reading. The words she had written were smudged from where his fingers had pressed against the paper, and a fresh wave of tears rolled down her cheeks. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I'm sorry. I tried. I tried to keep coming back, but I don't think I can do it anymore. I'm scared, Dad. I'm so scared." She buried her face in her knees, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She had promised her father she would be strong, but right now she felt anything but strong. She felt small and scared and alone. She wished more than anything that he was there, that he could wrap his arms around her and tell her everything would be okay. Meanwhile, Officer Brooks stood by the cafe, watching the crowd slowly disperse. The murmurs of disapproval and the accusing looks from the onlookers were not lost on him. He clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He had thought he was doing his job, keeping the neighborhood safe. But now, standing there, he wasn't so sure. He looked down at the spot where the girl had been sitting, her notebook still vivid in his mind. The words he had read haunted him. "I miss you, Dad." He hadn't seen a dangerous kid up to no good. He had seen a grieving daughter, clinging to the memory of her father the only way she knew how. A wave of guilt washed over him, a feeling he wasn't used to. He prided himself on being a good cop, on following his instincts, but now he had to wonder if those instincts had failed him. Had he been wrong about her? Had he let his own prejudices cloud his judgment? He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. He had done what he thought was right, but the image of the fear in her eyes, the way she had looked at him as if he were the monster in her story, wouldn't leave his mind. For the first time in a long time, Walter Brooks questioned himself. Shyla finally made her way home, her feet dragging as she walked through the front door. Her mother looked up from the kitchen, her face softening as she saw her daughter's tear-streaked face. "Shyla, sweetheart, what happened?" her mother asked, rushing over to kneel in front of her. Shyla shook her head, unable to find the words. She just wrapped her arms around her mother, holding her as tightly as she could. Her mother hugged her back, stroking her hair gently, whispering soothing words. "It's okay, baby. You're home now. You're safe," she whispered, though the worry in her eyes only deepened as she held her daughter close. Shyla didn't know if she could ever go back to the cafe. She didn't know if she could keep that promise to her father, but right now, in her mother's arms, she felt a small measure of safety, a small piece of the comfort she had been longing for, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. For now. The mistaken arrest had left a scar, a memory that would haunt both Shyla and Officer Brooks. For her, it was a reminder of how quickly her world could turn from a place of comfort to a place of fear. For him, it was a stark realization of how easily he could misjudge someone, how his own fears and biases could hurt the very people he was meant to protect. Their paths were far from over, and as Shyla clung to her mother and Walter stood alone by the cafe, both of them knew that this was just the beginning of something neither of them could yet understand. The door to the police precinct swung open with a heavy creak, and Shyla sat on the edge of a stiff wooden bench, her hands gripping the notebook as if her life depended on it. She stared down at her scuffed shoes, feeling small and out of place in the cold, fluorescent-lit room. Every sound, the click of handcuffs, the hum of voices, made her shrink further into herself. She just wanted to disappear, to wake up from this nightmare and be back in the cafe, writing to her dad. Officer Walter Brooks stood nearby, leaning against the counter with crossed arms, waiting for someone to pick her up. His frustration simmered just beneath the surface. In his mind, he was sure he'd been doing the right thing, but something about the whole situation gnawed at him. The way the girl clutched her notebook, the fear in her eyes, it didn't sit right. As Brooks tapped his fingers impatiently against his arm, the precinct door opened again, and a woman rushed inside, her face a mask of panic and anger. Shyla's mother, Monica Thompson, barely spared Brooks a glance before hurrying to her daughter's side. "Shyla!" she cried, kneeling down and pulling her daughter into her arms. "Are you okay? What happened, baby?" Shyla buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her small frame trembling with silent sobs. Monica held her daughter tightly, brushing back her hair with gentle hands. Then she stood and turned toward Officer Brooks, her expression shifting from concern to fury. "Why was my daughter brought here?" she demanded, her voice low but filled with controlled anger. "What did she do?" Brooks straightened up, caught off guard by the intensity in her voice. "She was acting suspiciously," he began, trying to keep his tone even. "She was hanging around outside the cafe every day. I asked her a few questions and she refused to answer. I had to investigate." Monica's eyes narrowed. "Investigate? She's 9 years old." Brooks opened his mouth to respond, but Monica cut him off with a sharp, biting tone. "You think a little girl sitting by herself is a threat? Did you even stop to ask yourself why she was there?" Brooks shifted uncomfortably under her glare. "She wouldn't tell me," he muttered. "She didn't have to tell you," Monica snapped, her voice rising. "You could have asked me before dragging her down here." Shyla clung to her mother's side, her tears subsiding into quiet sniffles as she listened to the heated exchange. Her mother's anger was fierce, but beneath it was a deep well of sorrow that matched her own. Monica turned toward her daughter, crouching down again so they were eye to eye. "It's okay, baby. Tell me what happened," she whispered, her voice softening. Shyla hesitated for a moment, then slowly held out her notebook. "He took this from me," she whispered. Monica's eyes softened as she took the notebook, running her fingers over its worn cover. She knew exactly what was inside. She had watched her daughter fill its pages day after day, pouring her heart into letters for a father who would never read them. She stood, holding the notebook firmly in her hands, and turned to face Officer Brooks once more. "You want to know why my daughter sits by that cafe every day?" she asked, her voice heavy with grief. "Because that was their place. My husband, her father, took her there every day before he left for his final tour." Brooks blinked, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. "Her father?" he repeated, his voice quieter now. "Yes." Monica's voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "He promised her that when he came back, they'd go there and celebrate, but he never got the chance." Brooks's throat tightened as he began to piece everything together. He didn't come back?" Monica shook her head, her expression both proud and heartbroken. "He died in Afghanistan. Saved his entire unit. They gave him a medal, folded up a flag, and handed it to my daughter as if that would be enough to fill the hole he left." She glanced down at the notebook, her hands trembling slightly. This is all she has left of him. These letters, they're the only way she knows how to keep him close. Brooks felt the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy stone. The notebook that he had torn from the girl's hands, the suspicion that had driven him to treat her like a criminal, it all seemed so meaningless now. He had looked at her and seen trouble, but in reality, she was just a little girl trying to hold on to the memory of a father she would never see again. Guilt crashed over him, suffocating in its intensity. He cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. I didn't know." "No," Monica said coldly. "You didn't." The silence that followed was deafening. Brooks stared at the ground, shame burning in his chest. He thought he had been doing his job, but now he realized how deeply his prejudices had clouded his judgment. He hadn't seen Shyla for who she really was, a grieving child trying to find comfort in the only way she knew how. Monica pulled her daughter closer, her eyes never leaving the officer. "I don't want you near my daughter again," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "You've done enough damage." Brooks nodded slowly, knowing there was nothing he could say to make things right. He had crossed a line, one that he couldn't uncross. Monica turned back to Shyla, her voice soft once more. "Come on, baby. Let's go home." Shyla hesitated, glancing back at Officer Brooks for a brief moment. There was no anger in her eyes, only sadness, deep and unrelenting. Then she turned and followed her mother out of the precinct, her notebook held tightly in her arms. Brooks watched them leave, the weight of his mistake settling heavily on his shoulders. He had thought he was protecting his community. Instead, he had hurt an innocent child. And for the first time in a long time, Officer Walter Brooks felt like he had truly failed. Officer Walter Brooks sat alone in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The hum of the radio, faint voices and static filled the silence around him, but he paid it no mind. His mind was far away, trapped in the echo of Monica Thompson's words and the haunted look in little Shyla's eyes. He had been doing his job, hadn't he? Protecting the neighborhood, following his instincts. But now those instincts felt like a curse, twisting his sense of duty into something dark and harmful. He had seen danger where there was none. He had taken a grieving child and turned her sanctuary into a place of fear. The realization gnawed at him, each passing moment adding weight to the guilt pressing against his chest. He thought back to all the times he'd told himself that he wasn't prejudiced. "I treat everyone the same." It was a mantra he'd repeated for years, as if saying it could make it true. But now, sitting in the heavy silence of his patrol car, he couldn't lie to himself any longer. He had treated Shyla differently. Not because she was dangerous, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because of the color of her skin. Brooks leaned back in his seat, running a hand over his face. He remembered the way she had clutched that notebook like it was her lifeline, the way her mother's voice had cracked as she talked about her husband's death. He saved his entire unit. The words echoed in his mind, sharp and unforgiven. A man who had given his life for his country. And Brooks had taken the only thing his daughter had left of him. Her letters, her memories. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, closing his eyes. His chest ached with something unfamiliar. Guilt, yes, but also shame. Deep, aching shame. He prided himself on being a good cop, on doing the right thing. But now he wondered, how many other times had he let his biases guide his actions? How many innocent people had suffered because he'd been too blinded by fear and prejudice to see them for who they really were? A memory surfaced, his own childhood, a time when he'd felt powerless and unseen. His older brother, James, had always protected him back then, standing up for him when the world felt too big and too cruel. But James was gone now, lost to addiction and bad decisions. Brooks had buried that part of his past deep inside, convinced that being tough, being a cop, was the only way to survive. But now, sitting in the quiet of his patrol car, he realized how much he had lost along the way. What if that had been me? He thought, the question cutting through his defenses like a knife. What if it had been James's daughter, sitting there writing letters to him? He had failed, Shyla. There was no denying it. And the worst part was, there was no going back, no undoing the damage he had caused. But maybe, just maybe, he could make things right. The thought was terrifying. It would mean facing his own flaws, admitting that he wasn't the man he thought he was. It would mean stepping outside the armor of his badge and confronting the parts of himself he had tried so hard to hide. But he had to try. Brooks sat up straighter, the weight in his chest shifting, though it didn't lift entirely. He knew what he had to do, even if the path ahead felt uncertain and frightening. He had to find a way to make things right, not just with Shyla, but with himself. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life beneath him. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. One step at a time. That was all he could do. And the first step was to show Shyla that he was sorry, not just with words, but with actions. He glanced at the small, crumpled note he had scribbled earlier, an address hastily written. It was the address of the café. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do when he got there, but he knew that it had to start there, at the place where everything had gone so wrong. With a deep breath, Brooks put the car in drive and pulled away from the precinct, the city lights blurring outside the windows. He didn't know if he could ever fully atone for what he had done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him, something fragile and uncertain, but real. Hope. Shyla sat on her bed, her notebook open on her lap. She had tried to write another letter to her father, but the words wouldn't come. Her hand hovered over the page, the pencil trembling in her grip. She wanted to tell him everything, about the officer, about the way she felt like she had failed him. But the words stayed locked inside her, too tangled and heavy to set free. Her mother's voice drifted in from the kitchen, soft and steady as she hummed an old lullaby. It was the same song she used to sing when Shyla was little, back when the world felt safer, when her father's laughter filled their home. Shyla closed her eyes, letting the familiar melody wrap around her like a blanket. For a moment, she imagined her father sitting beside her, his arm draped around her shoulder, telling her that everything would be okay. But when she opened her eyes, the room was empty, and the ache in her chest returned, heavier than before. She flipped to a blank page in her notebook and wrote slowly, her letters shaky but determined. "I tried, Dad. I really did. But it's so hard without you. I feel like I'm losing you all over again." She stared at the words for a long time, then added one more line. "I wish you were here." Her mother's voice drifted closer as she entered the room, carrying a steaming cup of cocoa. "Here, sweetheart," she said, placing the cup on the nightstand. "Thought you could use this." Shyla gave a small nod, her eyes still fixed on the page. Her mother sat down beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "It's okay to miss him," she whispered. "It's okay to feel sad." Shyla leaned into her mother's embrace, her small body trembling as the tears she had held back for so long finally spilled over. Her mother held her tightly, rocking her gently as she cried, whispering soothing words. "It's going to be okay, baby," her mother murmured. "We're going to be okay." And for the first time since her father's death, Shyla allowed herself to believe those words, if only just a little. Meanwhile, Brooks parked his patrol car a block away from the cafe, sitting in silence for a moment before stepping out. The night air was cool and the streets were quiet. He walked slowly toward the cafe, his mind racing. He didn't know what he was going to say when he saw her again. Apologies felt hollow, and words alone wouldn't be enough. But he was determined to try, no matter how difficult it would be. As he reached the cafe, he stood outside for a moment, staring at the place where Shyla had sat every day. The guilt weighed heavily on him, but beneath it was something else, a resolve to be better, to do better. He took a deep breath, then stepped inside. It was time to begin again. The sky had turned a deep indigo as the sun slipped beneath the horizon. Lights flickered on in the cafe, casting a soft, golden glow across the sidewalk. Inside, tables were arranged carefully for a special evening, one that would serve not only as a tribute to a fallen hero, but also as a chance to mend a broken connection. Officer Walter Brooks stood awkwardly by the entrance, the weight of his guilt and uncertainty pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. He glanced around, taking in the preparations. A small corner of the cafe had been transformed into a memorial, a framed photograph of Sergeant Michael Thompson in his uniform, flanked by flickering candles and an arrangement of white lilies. Brooks felt the sting of regret once more as he stared at the picture. This man, whose life he had dishonored through his careless actions, had given everything for people like him, people who wore the same uniform, carried the same badge. And Brooks had hurt the one person Sergeant Thompson had left behind. The cafe door swung open, and Shyla and her mother walked in. Shyla clutched her notebook tightly, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and apprehension. She hadn't known what to expect when her mother told her they were coming here tonight. Now, standing in the familiar glow of the cafe, she felt a pang of longing, for the father she had lost and for the comfort this place once gave her. Brooks cleared his throat and took a step forward. "Shyla," he began softly, his voice hesitant. But before he could continue, the cafe owner, Mr. Rodriguez, approached with a warm smile. "Welcome," he said gently, guiding them toward the memorial. "This is for you." Shyla's eyes widened as she saw the photograph of her father. Her breath hitched, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the frame, as if touching it would make him feel closer. "For your dad," Mr. Rodriguez added kindly. We wanted to honor him and you." Shyla stared at the photograph for a long moment, her heart swelling with emotions too big to name. She hugged her notebook tighter against her chest, her small hands trembling. Brooks took a cautious step closer, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't understand. I saw you sitting there, and I let my fears and prejudices blind me. I know that words aren't enough, but I'm truly sorry, Shyla." Shyla looked up at him, her expression unreadable. The officer's apology hung in the air between them, fragile and uncertain. Monica placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. "It's up to you, sweetheart," she whispered. "You don't have to forgive him if you're not ready." For a moment, silence filled the room. Shyla's small, tear-filled eyes locked with Brooks's, and the weight of everything that had happened seemed to hang between them. Then, slowly, Shyla opened her notebook and turned to a fresh page. She picked up a pen and began to write. The scratch of the pen on paper was the only sound in the room. When she finished, she tore the page out carefully and held it out to Brooks. He hesitated, glancing between the paper and her face. Then, with trembling hands, he took it from her. The note was short and simple. "I forgive you." Brooks felt his throat tighten, and he blinked rapidly, trying to keep his emotions in check. He looked back at Shyla, humbled by her quiet strength. "Thank you," he whispered. The cafe door opened once more, and several veterans entered, their faces lined with years of service and sacrifice. They greeted Monica warmly, exchanging stories of Michael's bravery and kindness. Shyla stood quietly, listening to every word, as if each story was a new piece of her father she could carry with her. One of the veterans knelt beside her, his voice soft. "Your dad was a hero," he said, "not just because of what he did for us, but because of how much he loved you. He talked about you all the time." Shyla's heart swelled with pride, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. A small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. As the evening went on, the cafe filled with warmth and laughter. Mr. Rodriguez brought out a large chocolate cake, just like the one her father had promised they'd share when he came back. Shyla sat at a table, surrounded by people who had known her father, people who understood the weight of her loss. Brooks watched from a distance, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. He knew that he still had a long way to go, that one evening couldn't undo the harm he had caused. But tonight, he had taken the first step toward being the man he wanted to be, the man Michael Thompson had fought for, the man Shyla deserved to see in the uniform. Before the night ended, Brooks approached Shyla one last time. "If you ever need anything," he said gently, "I'm here. I'll always be here." Shyla nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet acceptance. As the cafe slowly emptied and the candles flickered low, Shyla sat quietly at her father's memorial, her notebook open in front of her. She picked up her pen and wrote a final message for the day. "Hi, Dad. Today was a good day. I think you'll be proud of me. I'm going to keep coming back to our cafe, and I know you'll be here with me. Always." She closed the notebook with a soft smile, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. And across the room, Officer Brooks watched her, knowing that tonight wasn't just about remembering the past, it was about building something new, something better. It was the beginning of a second chance, for all of them. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the cafe, casting soft rays over the small memorial corner that now felt like a permanent part of the space. The photograph of Sergeant Michael Thompson stood proudly, surrounded by flowers and letters, a tribute to both his sacrifice and the enduring love between a father and daughter. Shyla sat at the same table where the memorial evening had taken place. Her notebook lay open before her, and a steaming cup of cocoa sat nearby, its warmth spreading through her hands as she cupped it. The cafe buzzed quietly around her, customers chatting, the sound of coffee machines humming, but Shyla felt at peace for the first time since her father's death. She picked up her pen, the words flowing more easily now. "Hi, Dad. I hope you saw everything last night. It was beautiful. Everyone said the most amazing things about you." Her hand paused briefly, and then she smiled, adding, "I think you would have really liked Officer Brooks, too." Across the room, Officer Walter Brooks stood quietly near the counter, waiting for his order. He glanced toward Shyla, catching her eye for a brief moment. She gave him a small, tentative smile, and, to his surprise, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. He nodded in return, a silent promise that he would be there for her in whatever way she needed. After the memorial evening, Brooks had gone home with a renewed sense of purpose. The guilt that had weighed so heavily on him hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had begun to transform into something else, something productive. He had reached out to his superiors, requesting training on community relations and implicit bias. He wanted to be better, not just for Shyla, but for every person he served. He had also started visiting the cafe regularly, not to keep watch over Shyla, but to check in as a friend. The first few visits had been awkward, both unsure of how to bridge the gap between them, but over time something fragile and meaningful had begun to grow. As Brooks picked up his coffee, Mr. Rodriguez, the cafe owner, leaned across the counter with a grin. "You're becoming a regular," he teased. "I'm starting to think you like my place more than your patrol routes." Brooks chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It's not the coffee that keeps me coming back," he admitted. Rodriguez gave a knowing nod. "You're a good man, officer. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Brooks sighed, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "It's just, there's a lot to make up for." Rodriguez placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "The fact that you care is a good start. Just keep showing up." Brooks glanced back at Shyla, who was now engrossed in her writing. "Yeah," he murmured. "I will." Shyla's mother, Monica, entered the cafe a few minutes later, her face softening as she saw her daughter sitting peacefully at the table. She walked over to Brooks, who straightened slightly, still getting used to the idea of being on friendly terms with her. "Thank you," Monica said quietly, her gaze following his to where Shyla sat. "For everything." Brooks shook his head, humbled by her words. "I'm just glad I could do something right." Monica smiled faintly. "We all make mistakes, Officer Brooks. What matters is that you're trying to make things better." Brooks gave her a grateful nod, then excused himself, leaving Monica to join her daughter. As he stepped outside into the crisp morning air, he felt lighter, as if the weight of his mistakes was no longer dragging him down, but instead guiding him toward something better. Inside the cafe, Shyla finished her letter with a flourish, her pen gliding smoothly over the paper. "I love you, Dad. I'll come back tomorrow. I'll always come back." She closed the notebook with a contented sigh, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. Monica sat down across from her, placing a hand over her daughter's. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Shyla smiled, a real, genuine smile. "Good," she whispered. I think Dad would be proud." Monica squeezed her hand gently. "He would be," she agreed, "and I'm proud of you, too." Shyla beamed, the warmth of her mother's words settling into her heart like sunshine after a long storm. Later that afternoon, as Shyla walked home with her mother, she saw Officer Brooks standing near his patrol car, talking with a group of children from the neighborhood. They were laughing, crowding around him as he showed them something from his utility belt. For the first time, Shyla saw him not as a scary authority figure, but as someone really trying, to do good. Brooks caught her eye, and for a moment they shared a silent understanding. He gave her a small wave, and she waved back, a sense of quiet gratitude passing between them. As they continued walking, Monica glanced down at her daughter. "Ready to go home?" Shyla nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. "Yeah," she said softly. "But first, can we come back tomorrow?" Monica smiled, brushing a hand over Shyla's curls. "Of course, baby. We'll always come back." Shyla looked up at the sky, the sun shining brightly overhead, and whispered, "I love you, Dad." And as they walked down the street together, hand in hand, Shyla knew that she was no longer alone. Her father's love was with her, always. And now, so was hope. The future felt brighter than it had in a long time, and she was ready for it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Hit that notification bell to stay updated. And while you're here, check out our other videos. There's always more to discover. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you.